Okay, Judges 8. Judges 8. We will continue our study this morning, or this evening. It's morning somewhere. Gideon. We'll look at Gideon again. We're actually going to finish up his life. Remember, Judges, the cycle. Same old cycle. It's kind of, it's, I think I mentioned, I was teaching this one time, and it's just like, somebody said, we're still trudging our way through Judges, just the wickedness. And another person said, I feel like I got to take a shower after reading Judges because it's just dirty and just the disobedience. Well, that's what life looks like when God is kicked out. And that's how it's supposed to look. It's supposed to look like that. The cycle of disobedience, discipline. God disciplines. God turns them over to the enemy. They cry out. That's despair. And then deliverance. He always sends a rescuer. So it's a book that shows the badness of what sin produces. But it's a book of grace. He always sent a rescuer when they said, God help us. So really it's a prophetic book because it points us to Jesus, our Savior rescuer. So Gideon, the fourth judge out of 12. The last couple weeks we were inspired with Gideon's story. Last week the great victory that God gave Gideon and his army of 300, that weak, insignificant army. But chapter 8, that's normally where we stop with Gideon because, that's the story. That's what Gideon's remembered by. But chapter 8 takes a bad turn. Sadly, the rest of Gideon's life is not good. And this is the part that's often not taught. But it's good application for us. Gideon started off well, but he didn't finish well. So look at verse 1. Then the people of Ephraim asked Gideon. Okay, Ephraim was a powerful tribe. They were the fighting tribe. And if you remember the end of last week's lesson, after the Midianites were defeated, Gideon calls Ephraim. He calls some tribes and he says, now let's go get them. So they were called in to chase the Midianites down. But here's what they said. Why have you treated us this way? Why didn't you send for us when you first sent out to fight the Midianites? And they argued heatedly with Gideon. The fact is Gideon did call them in, but he didn't call them in at first. They wanted to be part of the 300. Why do you think? They were the warriors, right? They wanted to get the glory. But remember, the whole battle was God's battle. God's going to get the glory. He whittled them down to nothing, basically, so no man can get the glory. So that's what this is all about. They felt like, they felt like, they should be included in that so they could get the thrill of victory and the glory. But that's, like I said, that's why God only used the 300, so that no one could get the glory but him. This also proves what God said about the people. He said, if I have a big crew out there, if I have the strongest and the massive army, they'll take credit. So, this case in point. Verse 2. But Gideon replied, what have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't even the leftover grapes of Ephraim's harvest better than the entire crop of my little clan of Abiezer? God gave you victory over Oreb and Zeb, the commanders of the Midianite army. What have I accomplished compared to that? When the men of Ephraim heard Gideon's answer, their anger subsided. I like how Gideon dealt with them. He didn't just come back and blow up at them. He was acting in a diplomatic manner. He was pumping them up, giving them credit for their accomplishments. And so it's a good way to handle them. But verse 4, this is when things start to shift and change with Gideon. Verse 4, Gideon then crossed the Jordan River with his 300 men. And though exhausted, they continued to chase the enemy. Actually what we're going to see in just a minute, that when Gideon crossed the river, it's like he turned into this completely different guy. So this crossing is the opposite of Joshua's crossing. Remember, Joshua crossed the Jordan to the Canaan land. What's happening is Gideon is crossing the Jordan. He's leaving the land of promise. So Joshua's coming in. Gideon's leaving the land of promise. He's going beyond the scope of what God told him to do. He's crossing. He's leaving his land. God never said to leave, but that's what he's doing. He's wanting to cross so he could take over more territory and more land. So he was never asked by God to cross the Jordan. So he's being disobedient. So we could say, and this is a good little application right here, he crossed a boundary that he never should have crossed. When he crossed that boundary, that's when the downfall started for him. And don't you know, when we cross boundaries we shouldn't cross, bad usually happens. There's a whole book called Boundaries. I mean, it's a wonderful book about setting boundaries in place. And when you cross these boundaries, and it's a relational book, but when you cross these boundaries, not good happens, if that's even a good proper English phrase. The equivalent of not good would be bad, right? Okay. Verse 5, when they reached Succoth, Gideon asked that's what sucketh. The baby sucketh the bottleth. That's King James for English. So Gideon asked the leaders of the town, please give my warriors some food. They're very tired. Now he's out, remember, he's crossed the boundary. He's in a place he shouldn't be. I'm chasing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. But the officials of Succoth replied, catch Zebah and Zalmunna first, and then we'll feed your army. We're not going to give you anything right now. You catch them first. Then we'll feed the army. So Gideon, that fired him up. He said, after the Lord gives me victory over Zebah and Zalmunna, I will return and tear your flesh with the thorns and briars from the wilderness. So, that's a serious threat right there, with the thorns and the briars of the wilderness. Number one, Gideon should not even be here. This shows that Gideon's already forgetting about God's victory. He's already forgetting that it's God alone who gives the victory. I've got to stay under the authority of God. No one can take credit. He's starting to get the big head. He's starting to get the big head. He's acting like a big shot. Like he actually had something to do with winning the battle. He had nothing. All he did was just blow the horn and throw the pots down, right? That's all he did. So he thinks he's the big shot. They're dissing him. They're not giving him the respect. So he's acting like this big bad general. All right, I'm going to come back. I'm going to take the briars. I'm going to tear your flesh. That'll teach you a lesson from disrespecting me. So it says in verse 8, from there Gideon went up to Peniel and again asked for food, but he got the same answer. So he said to the people of Peniel, after I return in victory, I will tear down this tower. So one place he's ripping their flesh with the briars. The next, I'm going to tear this tower down. By this time, Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with about 15,000 warriors, all that remained of the allied armies of the east. For 120,000 had already been killed. Thanks to God. Gideon circled around the caravan route east of Nobah and Jogbehah, taking the Midianite army by surprise. Zebah and Zalmunna, the two Midianite kings, fled, but Gideon chased them down, captured all their warriors. After this, Gideon returned from the battle by the way of Heres Pass. There he captured a young man from Succoth and demanded that he write down the names of all the 77 officials and elders in the town. These are the guys who said, kill the enemy and then we'll give you food. So Gideon's like, I want every single name of all the leaders of this town. I mean, this guy is vengeful. Gideon then returned to Succoth and said to the leaders, "Here are Zebah and Zalmunna. When we were here before, you taunted me, saying, 'Catch Zebah and Zalmunna first, and then we'll feed your exhausted army.' Then Gideon took the elders of the town and taught them a lesson, punishing them with thorns and briars from the wilderness. He also went to Peniel, tore down the tower, killed all the men in the town." That's what you get for not feeding me. When all I wanted was a little bit of food. That's it. But that's not good. This is not good. This is all out from under the authority of God. I mean, he goes on a tear. It's a vengeful tear. He's doing this out of vengeance. He's doing this out of pride. I mean, he has stepped out from under the authority of God. He's become like a tyrant, a vengeful tyrant, which proves he's wanting the glory, he's wanting the respect, he's prideful. I mean, So it says in verse 18, "Then Gideon asked Zebah and Zalmunna, 'The men you killed at Tabor, what were they like?' 'Like you,' they replied. 'They all had the look of a king's son.' Verse 19, 'They were my brothers, the sons of my mother,' Gideon exclaimed. 'As surely as the Lord lives, I wouldn't kill you if you hadn't killed them.'" Okay, so now we see why he's ticked off, why he's on this rampage, because his brothers they killed his brothers. So he's on a revenge tour, basically. And the problem is he's becoming more motivated to avenge his brother's death than to rescue his people Israel. Vengeance is what is his motivation, rather than God called me to rescue my people. So that's what he's motivated by. Verse 20, turning to Jether, his oldest son, he said, "Kill them." But Jether did not draw his sword, for he was only a boy and was afraid. I mean, gets his young boy involved in this. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said to Gideon, "Be a man, kill us yourself." So Gideon said, "Okay." He killed them both, took the royal ornaments from the necks of their camels. So this is a completely different Gideon, isn't it? You know, when he was found a couple chapters ago, he was found hiding in the wine press. He was weak. He was timid. He very humble. He went to the rock, offered the sacrifice, all of that. God called. I mean, this is not the same guy. You know, God used him because he was humble, because he was meek. Now he's a tyrant. The success is going to his head. He's no longer looking to the Lord as his strength. When he was weak, the Lord could work through him. But now it's all going to his head. He sees he is his strength now. He's his own victory. As a matter of fact, he only refers to the Lord 2 more times the rest of the chapter. The rest of his life, we only read of 2 more references to the Lord. And both of those references basically were just to justify his actions. So he turns. He completely turns. This new person that Gideon has become shows that his success in battle has actually become the worst thing for him. It's actually become the worst thing for him. Back in chapter 7, verse 15, when Gideon recognized his weakness, when he understood that victory could only be by God's grace, he was humbled and worshiped God. Now he's worshiping success. He's worshiping the honor of being a commander. He's entirely forgotten who called him and who won the battle for him. You know, there's a lot of application that we can take from that as well. You know, because so often, I mean, it's easy for us to forget what the Lord has done in our lives, that we're nothing apart from God's grace. It's only by the grace of God. I mean, Without God's grace, we're weak. We have no ability of our own. Ephesians 2:8-9, it's by grace you've been saved through faith. It's not from yourselves, it's the gift of God. Salvation is a gift of grace. We do nothing to earn it. And just anything in life, anything good is a gift from God. It's not by our work, so that no one can boast. And so everything that we are, everything we have, is a result of the grace of God. Gideon forgot it, and we forget that too. Look at verse 22. Then the Israelites said to Gideon, "You be our ruler. You and your son and your grandson will be our rulers, for you have rescued us from Midian." They've already kicked God out as king. God was supposed to be king. He said God was supposed to be king. But now, they're calling on Gideon. So just as Gideon has forgotten who gave them victory over Midian, so the rest of Israel's also forgotten. You would think that they would be turning to God. Look what the Lord has done, right? But no, now they think Gideon's the one who gave us the victory. We want Gideon as our king. Gideon rescued us. But Gideon did nothing. It was all God. And ultimately, the judges, the whole purpose of the judges, they were not to rule over the people. God was king. God was ruler. They were just supposed to rescue the people. They were supposed to judge the people. Okay, case in point. Let's take a contemporary example of modern judges. The judges are not meant to legislate, are they? In today's culture. The judges are not put there to rule and be an executive branch. All they're there to do is just interpret the law. That's it. But the judges, it's become politicized, right? It's almost like the judges have more power than the legislative branch, than the president. It's kind of the same thing. The judges were never meant to rule over the people. God was to rule. God was to be king. So, it just continually shows that how Israel keeps rejecting God as king. Look at verse 23. Mr. Tyrant all of a sudden pulls the pious card, Mr. Holier than thou. He says, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son. The Lord will rule over you." Okay, really? Mr. Vengeance. As you're reading this, it seems like this is a good thing. But I'm telling you, this is he's pious here. This is fake. Because based on verse 24, you'll see he's not humble and desiring the Lord to rule over them. And actually, this is the last time Gideon speaks of the Lord. Verse 24, he says, "However, I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from the plunder you collected from your fallen enemies." And then it says, the enemies being the Ishmaelites all wore gold earrings. So weird. It's just so strange. He says the Lord will rule over you. But then actually he starts to act like a king, because this is what kings do. They want the plunder of the enemy. So he's speaking one way, but he's doing the complete opposite. Give me the plunder. Give me the gold earrings, the bounty. And then verse 25. "Gladly," they replied. So they spread out a cloak, and each one threw in a gold earring he had gathered from the plunder. The weight of the gold earrings was 43 pounds, not including the royal ornaments and pendants, the necklaces and all that. The purple clothing worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains around the necks of the camels. Imagine that. They put jewelry on their camels. Well, people do that today, I guess, right? Not camels. I know I see people they'll dress up their dogs and stuff, where they'll put little shoes on them and hats on them and all that. So now look at 27. So Gideon, So Gideon made a sacred ephod from gold and put it in Ophrah, his hometown. But soon all the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping it, and it became a trap for Gideon and his family. Do you remember a story where gold was collected?
Golden calf.
Yeah, kind of the same thing. The people, Aaron, they took the gold, they made the calf, the people bowed down to the calf. Here, Gideon's trying to be pious. He's trying to, we'll make a golden ephod. I'll tell you what an ephod is. But in the people, they start to worship this golden ephod just like they worship the calf. The ephod, what's an ephod? The ephod was worn by the priest, by the high priest. It was almost like a bib. It goes over, and it would have like the 12 stones. There was actually 2 stones in the middle, the Urim and the Thummim, and he would use those stones to determine God's will. So this was a priestly vesture that only the high priest could wear. So, Gideon's saying, the Lord will rule over you. But I mean, it's almost like he's making himself out to be the ruler. And not just that, it's almost like he's making himself out to be the high priest. I mean, this is blasphemous right here. So, and then he takes that ephod and he puts it in his hometown. So it's just blasphemous all the way around, as if his hometown is to be a center of worship. Like we'll read later, if we do more studies, in the Samuel, Shiloh was a center of worship. Jerusalem's a center of worship. He was wanting to make his hometown a center of worship. And so, the point is he was called by God to rescue his people, to turn his people away from unfaithfulness, to turn them away from idolatry, to turn his people back to God. But here, he's leading them deeper into unfaithfulness. And they use that word prostitute. They prostituted themselves. They were unfaithful. Like the story of Hosea that we did a couple weeks ago. Like that unfaithful Gomer that went out. They were acting like the prostitute. They were unfaithful. Verse 28. So we wind it down. So that's the story of how the people of Israel defeated Midian, which never recovered. Throughout the rest of Gideon's lifetime, about 40 years, there was peace in the land. Okay, there was peace, but this wasn't godly peace. There might have been an absence from war, but this was not godly peace. Notice 40 years left, Gideon's life. You don't hear anything else about Gideon. Then it said in verse 29, then Gideon, son of Joash, returned home. Oh, well, here's what he did for 40 years. He made 70 babies. That's what he did. 70 sons born to him. So that's what he did for 40 years. For he had many wives. He also had a concubine in Shechem who gave birth to a son whom he named Abimelech. Actually, he's acting like a king, because that was what the kings did. They took wives. They took wives from around the nations and had concubines and all. That's how kings lived. Matter of fact, check this out. Who gave birth to a son who he named Abimelech. We'll talk about Abimelech next week. The name Abimelech means my father is king. So don't tell me you want God to rule. You name your own son, my father is king. So he has just become this narcissistic tyrant who's turned his back. He's forgotten about the grace of God. He's forgotten where he came from. That he was nothing when God found him. So how could Gideon refuse to become a king because he knows God is king, but then act like one? Because he only had the head knowledge. He only had the head knowledge. Yeah, God is to be ruler. He didn't have the heart knowledge. The fact is, God never ruled in his heart. He never gave space in his heart for God to rule. And that's the challenge for us. Is God the king of your life? Is God ruling in your heart? Or are we making our golden efforts because we want the honor, because we want the glory? So much to consider in this story. Ultimately, we need to consider Jesus. Remember, Jesus is our judge, our ultimate rescuer. He's the anti-Gideon. He's the anti-Gideon. He's the only, true judge worthy of honor and glory. Jesus deserved the glory, but he never demanded it, did he? Jesus deserved to be treated like a king on earth. He deserved servants. He deserved all the pomp and circumstance, but he never demanded it. As a matter of fact, Mark 10:45, he said, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many." You know, the greatest leaders are servants, right? The greatest leaders are servants. Verse 32, last verse. Gideon died when he was very old, and he was buried in the grave of his father Joash. Remember Joash? He tore down the Baals. Remember? I mean, wow, he had such promise. He was buried in the grave of his father Joash at Ophrah in the land of the clan of Abiezer. Okay, so I'm going to give you three applications, three final applications from the story of Gideon. We know about his beginning, the weakness, God getting the glory, but I mean, really, how you end, that's your story. It's not how you start, it's how you end. Here's three applications. Number one, it's possible to start well and end badly. That's what happened to Gideon. It's not how you start, it's how you end. Good men can go bad. You know, unfortunately, with years of pastoring, I've seen people come to the Lord. They serve God. They're faithful to church. They're on fire for the Lord and all of the rest that goes with it. And they're prayer warriors. And they backslide, and you know, it's tragic to see people end badly. You know, we think of the triumph last week, the triumph, but the tragedy, the end of his life. That's why we need to stay humble before the Lord. That's why we need to be watchful. That's why we need to stay dependent on God. Remember God's grace. Remember God's grace. It's God's grace. Number two, some boundaries should never be crossed. The trouble started when he stepped out of the scope of God's will. That's when he crossed the boundary. I'm going to have to preach this sometime. When he crossed the boundary, trouble started. Trouble started. I mean, is that a good point or what? I mean, think about, what you've told your kids. When you cross this boundary, trouble starts. That's why nothing good happens after dark. That's why you need to be home. It's after midnight. Nothing good happens after midnight. That's a boundary you come home. Think about it. When I say some boundaries should never be crossed, spiritually, what do you think that means? What are some spiritual boundaries that we cannot cross?
Well, just like Gideon, he forgot who was in charge, who God was. He forgot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, he forgot. I think of three simple things: your eyes, your ears, your mouth. I think of that. What we look at, the Bible says the eyes are the window to our soul. The eyes. I mean, think about, how, especially for young folks these days, think about how prevalent pornography is online, and it just warps, it distorts. What about the ears? What we listen to, what comes in, our openings. Jesus said it's not what goes out, it's what comes in that defiles us. What about those boundaries? What about a mouth? What about the things we say? People, that old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never harm me. Wrong. Words destroy. Words harm. So I mean those are just boundaries in relationships. There's just certain boundaries that we need to set. Lastly, there's a danger that comes with success that we've got to heed. There's dangers with success. When I think of, what do you think of, what are some dangers of success? If you look at Gideon's life. Did he become prideful?
He thought he had a lot of power.
He thought he had power. Yeah.
Wanting more stuff.
Wanting more stuff. I kind of think about, just popped in my brain just now. I think about, how people, they want to win the lottery, and win the hundreds of billions. But what about all the people, they win the money and they die broke, or tragedy happens, or whatever, because there's a danger with success. And tempted to fall away from God. When things are going well, that's usually when people are more tempted to backslide. Usually when things are going bad in their life, that's when people turn to God. I'm coming back to church. I've seen it over and over again. Something happened, and marriage is falling apart, and they're coming to church and they're crying and they're at the altar and all that. But success, usually when people become successful, 90% of the time, success doesn't draw people to the Lord. Success takes people further away from God. I'm successful. I can get this new boat. We'll go out Sunday to the lake. I'll get this. That's just it's just human nature. Success, there's a temptation with success. Now, it doesn't mean that success is bad. You just got to be aware of it. The fact of the matter is, really, godly, Christian, successful people, that's what this world needs. People that can handle it, The Bible says the wealth of the wicked is laid up for the righteous. So God wants to bless people, but the problem is, can we take it? Can we handle it? And so Gideon could not. He could not handle success. So 3 lessons. It's possible to start well and end badly. Some boundaries should never be crossed. And there's a danger that comes with success that must be heeded. And so let's consider the life of Gideon. There's a lot of good in his life, but there's also a lot of bad in his life as well.